Hi, everybody. As you can see, I'm having a little bit of difficulty with some technology off to the side here. It's just going to take me 1 second to hopefully get this set up. Just give me 1 second. And we are going to get started in just 1 second. I'm not sure now why this isn't doing. There we go, finally. So my name is Lori Jump. I'm a citizen of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians, which is located in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I'm also the director of StrongHearts Native Helpline. And today what I wanted to do was just to start out with a land acknowledgement. I think that, you know, it's really something that's really important for us to do is to acknowledge that, you know, the land, no matter where we are, is land that was once occupied by our ancestors. So today I'm coming to you from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, as I said. It's the land of the Anishinaabe. And what I've always been told is that what that means is original people. And so this is the land of, you know, the original peoples from this area. My ancestors were hunters and fishermen and gatherers. So the land is really important to us. And these are some pictures from actually right outside my door. You know, just it's a beautiful area, and I'm so thankful for the land that I get to occupy today. And understand that, you know, this is where my ancestors are from. And so I thank them for everything that they left for me to enjoy. In general, you know, I wanted just to talk a little bit about kind of where we are as a nation of nations. You know, Native Americans make up about 2% of the US population. There's somewhere between 5 and 6 million Native Americans in the country, 574 federally recognized tribes. There are about 60 state recognized tribes. And our tribes really enjoy a unique legal relationship with the US government. We are, you know, recognized as being separate from the US federal government, but also separate from the states. And with that status comes, you know, both the responsibility and the authority to govern our people. And we do that through the adoption of codes and laws and, you know, the various forms of government that we have. As I said, you know, sovereignty is a very important piece of who we are and what we do. And our people really had vibrant societies. You know, they were really well established. They were rich in history, rich in culture, rich in traditions. And, you know, I like to say that we lived a simple life, you know, but some people misunderstand what I mean by simple. You know, we were not simpletons or simple people, really. We had complex relationships with each other and, you know, in our communities, but our lives were simple. You know, we did what we needed to do to survive. And yet we did have, as I said, those complex relationships and complex systems of dealing with things that, you know, went wrong in our communities. Traditionally, you know, the role of women were held in high esteem. Not only were we life givers, you know, and really just the lifeblood of the tribes, but we held leadership roles within our communities, and we provided advice to our leaders. And so, you know, we were sacred, really, and violence was not traditional. It was not tolerated in our communities, you know, and we had punishments for it, um, you know, up to and including death. And so it's something that, um, as I said, was not tolerated and was dealt with quickly, you know, in our societies. And I'm going to play this video. Whoops.
The stories of American Indians and Alaska Natives are as varied and nuanced as the people themselves. But the latest study from the National Institute of Justice finds one troubling through line that links these stories: the experience of high rates of violence. Like songs and oral histories, science can raise awareness by quantifying the severity of violence. It's time to hear what the numbers are saying. The vast majority of American Indian and Alaska Native women and men have experienced violence in their lifetime, and 1 in 3 have experienced recent violence in the past year. Those levels are higher than the general population, but that's not where the inequalities end. The study also measures a range of impacts as well as services needed because of violence. What's behind those numbers? Let's start with the finding that for American Indians and Alaska Natives, violence doesn't discriminate by gender. Women and men share similar rates of victimization. That means almost 3 million American Indian and Alaska Native women and men have been victims of violence. To put that number in perspective, imagine if everyone in the state of Iowa stood up, or every resident of Orlando, Dallas, Detroit, Anchorage, and Atlanta combined. That's the scale of the violence. But what about the scope? The NIJ study breaks types of violence into 4 categories, and violence against American Indians and Alaska Natives is high across all of them. Take stalking, for example. It can be a gateway to more aggressive violence, and repeated, unwanted, fear-inducing experiences come in many forms. Lifetime estimates of stalking for women in the study are almost double those of non-Hispanic whites. Add male and female victims together, and that's more than 1.2 million people. That would fill 20 sports stadiums if every single ticket holder had been stalked. Being forced or coerced to engage in unwanted sexual activity is another form of violence, a form all too familiar to American Indians and Alaska Natives. For example, these mothers, daughters, and sisters face almost 2 times the risk of sexual violence with penetration as non-Hispanic white women. Overall rates of physical violence by intimate partners in the past or present are even higher, from being shoved to having a gun or knife used on them. More than 1 in every 2 women and more than 1 in every 3 men have experienced physical violence by intimate partners in their lifetimes, comparatively much higher than the physical victimization rates over the lifetimes of non-Hispanic whites. Of course, not all violence is sexual or physical, so the NIJ study also examines psychological aggression. For example, expressions of anger that seem dangerous or humiliating, or controlling access to birth control. Overall, psychological aggression affects more than 1 in every 2 women and men. Psychological aggression may not be as obvious as broken bones or bruises, but it is real. Among victims, 63% of women report partners tracking them, and 55% of women report being kept from family or friends. These are just a few findings, but remember, they are numbers that correspond to real victims who would fill the entire state of Iowa. Now picture if 97% of women and 90% of men in Iowa were victimized by people of other races and ethnicities, interracial perpetrators who violated the safety of their schools, workplaces, parks, homes, and bedrooms. Numbers alone don't tell the whole story, but they do point to a dangerous gap. Most federally recognized tribes don't have the legal authority to criminally prosecute non-Indians, even for crimes committed on tribal lands. So, what does it all mean? The impacts of high rates of violence against American Indians and Alaska Natives range from missed days of work or school to physical injuries. It's not surprising that services are needed, like medical care to treat injuries. But here's where the NIJ results uncover another glaring disparity. Almost 40% of female victims who need services can't get them, compared with only 15% of non-Hispanic white female victims who fall through the cracks. American Indians and Alaska Natives deserve better, and now there is science to prove it. These numbers are not abstract. They bear witness to real people, mothers, girlfriends, brothers, and grandfathers. Our hope is that this study will lead to a story of a new beginning, one where all of us listen to what the science is saying, what the victims are saying, and unite to prevent violence wherever it happens.
Ah, so as the video showed you, when we talk about violence against our relatives, the statistics are extremely high. 84.3% of our women have experienced violence in their lifetimes. That's 8 out of 10. So, if there's 100 people on this webinar, it's 84 of us that have experienced violence. 56% have experienced sexual violence, so more than half. And when we look at those who have experienced sexual violence, 96% of that has been at the hands of a non-native perpetrator. And that's really important when we talk about why our rates are so high. Our rates of PTSD in Native American adults, 4.5 times the national average. And for our children, it's 3 times the national average. This has been compared to the PTSD that a soldier that has seen combat would experience. And so it's a very high level and it's unacceptable. For murder of Native women in some states, it's 10 times the national average, 10 times. And more than 3 out of 4 are killed by their intimate partners. So, how did we get here? We started out talking about historically how our communities lived and how violence wasn't a piece of that, and certainly not violence against women and children. So how do we go from that, very traditional way of living to the types of rates of violence that we see now in our communities? And really it goes back to historical trauma. I used to be somebody who was never a history buff, and I really thought that rather than looking backwards all the time, we really needed to look forward and, yes, learn from our lessons. But gosh, wasn't it time to get over the past? And I'm embarrassed to say that, but it's the truth. And I was about 40 years old, the first time I heard somebody talk about historical trauma and really came to understand why it's so important to know our history. Because for us, we're still being impacted by the history that our ancestors experienced. You know, and it's important for us to understand what the various policies of the United States regarding Native Americans have been over, you know, the past, you know, 200 years. And to really look at each of those eras and understand what was done during those times, what the policies regarding Native Americans was, and how how it actually played out. And most of us don't know this stuff, right? And if you don't know it, you know, don't blame yourself. The fact of the matter is this stuff is not taught in our school system. Still today, it's not taught in our school system. And so, you know, if you don't know it, as I said, don't blame yourself. It's not your fault for sure. But I do recommend that you take a look back and see what some of the policies were. You know, there are various, as I said, different eras. You know, termination was one of them, you know, where, you know, they really wanted to terminate the existence of tribes and reservations. You know, there was the removal period where, you know, everybody's heard, I'm sure, of the Trail of Tears. You know, most, I think, blatant example, but other tribes experienced the same, you know, removal from their ancestral lands and being pushed westward onto, you know, less hospitable lands. You know, I think probably for me personally, I think the most damaging period of time, the most damaging era and policy was of assimilation, where the policy was to, as Richard Pratt said, kill the Indian and save the man. And what they were talking about was really removing everything about us that was Indian and replacing it with the ways of themselves, you know. And so we had the boarding school era, which I think, as I said, was the most damaging. Yes, they were all horrible and they resulted in horrible things happening to our people. But the boarding school era was one where children were taken from our families at very young ages, forcibly removed, and not returned home for many years, if at all. And as a result of that removal, you know, their hair was cut. They were forced to wear the clothing of the white man. They were forced to speak English. They weren't allowed to speak their own language. They weren't allowed to practice any of their traditions or ceremonies. And in fact, they were punished severely if they did. They were basically workhorses in these schools. You know, they were taught, certainly they did learn some of the, you know, the 3 R's, the reading, writing, and arithmetic, but really they were taught skills so that they could survive as servants to our colonizers. But, you know, they were tortured, really. They, you know, many kids tried to run away and died in the process. I'm sure you've seen pictures of, you know, the graves, you know, at some of these schools where they were buried under the names that they were given. So even if somebody were to go there, they wouldn't find the name of their child on, you know, as they were known in their community. They would see all of these names that nobody knows who those kids actually were. And if kids were lucky enough to go home, they went home wearing different clothing, different hairstyles, speaking a different language, and not knowing their history. They're not knowing their ceremonies. And so their people found them to be too white, right, to really fit into their community. And yet at the same time, they could never be white enough to fit in mainstream society. And so this caused such trauma to our people, that the impact of it is still being felt today. These children who went through these schools, they weren't raised in families, so they never learned how to parent. They were institutionalized. They learned that if you did anything bad, you should be beaten. They learned coping skills of substance abuse, right? And not talking about what happened to them, because if they told somebody, they were beaten even more. And so it's this historical trauma is something that, yes, it began hundreds of years ago, but it still exists today, and it still impacts our people today. And so, I think that just as Native Americans, we all have a responsibility to understand this. And I wish I had started my education a lot sooner than I did. So when we do have all of this violence in our communities, and at the same time, we have many barriers to justice and safety for our relatives. Certainly part of that is, in our small communities, we have this philosophy of being related to everybody, but sometimes it's more than that, right? Sometimes it is physically, literally your cousin that you might have to report something to, or maybe it's the perpetrator's, uncle who is the law enforcement officer, and it gets very hard to disclose abuse that's happening to you when it's to somebody that you're either related to or your perpetrator is related to. Because of our history, we have just this historical distrust of local authorities, right? These people that were supposed to be helping us really did some horrible things to us and to our communities. And it's hard for us to trust, especially, federal agencies or state agencies. There's this resource disparity, for us that isn't felt as badly as in other areas. We're geographically remote. We don't have transportation. We don't have health care, law enforcement services. Sometimes we don't have access to, medical care. We don't have people that are working in the field of domestic violence that understand what's going on and how best to respond. And so there's a whole lot of barriers that when you are a victim, to overcome in your search for justice and even for safety. When we look at the cross-jurisdictional issues, in most of our tribal communities, tribes don't have the authority to prosecute a non-native person. Now, VAWA 2013 did improve that. We now have the ability to prosecute certain cases, but the majority of tribes have not implemented that for many reasons, cost being one of them, of course. And so there's all of these barriers to even reaching out and asking for help. So when we're talking about intimate partner violence, just, as a term of its own, we have it can sometimes be called domestic violence. Sometimes it's called family violence, but the correct term is actually intimate partner violence. And that's a pattern of behavior and abuse to gain and maintain power and control over a partner. And there are a lot of different ways that, different tactics that are used to gain that control and then maintain it. Everybody knows what physical abuse is. You know, that's the slap, the punch, the pinching, broken bones. You know, the emotional abuse is just that attacking you for who you are, right? You're stupid, you're dumb, you know, you're fat and ugly. All of the things that tear down your sense of self-esteem. Sexual abuse within intimate partner violence is, you know what, using sex to, you know, force you to do things that you may not want to do, you may not feel comfortable doing, forcing you to have sex when you don't want to have sex. Financial abuse, of course, maintaining control over all of the funding that comes into the family, not being allowed to spend money, even the money that you make, you know, having to turn it over to your partner. And, you know, that's the type of abuse that really impairs somebody's ability to leave a situation, you know, when they don't have access to money. Digital abuse, you know, using the internet, you know, we're all dependent upon it anymore. You know, we're doing this via Zoom, but, you know, using electronic means to track you, to see who you're talking to monitor what you're saying. And then the reason we're here today is cultural abuse. And this really is a very specific form of abuse that really just attacks who you are at the core of yourself. You know, it's attacking your beliefs about life. And it's very damaging, and it makes it very hard to escape these situations. There really are two facets to it. I think, you know, one really is identity driven. You know, talking about your skin color. You know, I've always been told that I don't look particularly Native. I have, you know, the lighter skin of my non-Native father. You know, and so you're not dark enough. You don't have dark skin. You can't be a real Indian, right? Or look at how dark you are. You know, are you sure you're Native American? Are you sure you're not something else? Stereotypes. You know, if you think of all the bad things you've ever heard about Native Americans, right? We're dumb. We are drunks. We're lazy. We always have our hands out for something free. You know, and those are stereotypes that we fight against every day, you know, and then to have those thrown in your face on a continual basis is just exhausting, really. You know what, you're an Apple Indian, you're red on the outside, but white on the inside. You know, just basically calling you fake. Blood quantum is something that we hear a lot about. You know, and blood quantum really was a tool of colonization as well, right? I mean, is there anybody else that you know of that has to say what degree of blood quantum they have? You know, nobody asks you, well, how much French are you? Or how much German? How much Italian? Nobody does that. But in Indian country, you know, we do it to ourselves sometimes, right? You know, and that really is just a tool of colonization, really. And it was to eventually bring us down to zero. It was to eliminate us. You know, if we didn't marry or have children within our communities, our blood quantum of our children is less. And if we continue to do that, pretty soon it would be, you know, something that you just couldn't even calculate, that it didn't matter anymore. And so that has been used, you know, oh, you're only a quarter? Well, you're not even a real Indian. Your own tribe doesn't want you. As some tribes have adopted different, you know, varying levels of blood quantum requirements to be a full citizen. And then that tribal citizenship can be used as well in terms of, you know, my tribe doesn't do that, so you can't do it. Your tribe doesn't, it discriminates against me as a non-native person, and that's used against you. Just all the ways that actually being a citizen of a tribe, which is so important to us, is used against us, right? So that is in there as well. And then the ceremony driven one really is ceremony is how we heal, right? It's how we, oh gosh, restore ourselves. It's very important to us as Native Americans. So when you have somebody that is ridiculing your traditions, your ceremonies, making fun of them, oh, going to another powwow, preventing you from participating in ceremony. So not letting you go to a sweat, not letting you smudge in your own home, not letting you gather with your relatives in times of need, forcing you to participate in ceremonies that are not your own. For me, for my tribe, many of us were raised in organized religion because of the boarding school era. They stopped practicing our own ways. And so we were raised in that, I was raised as a Catholic, right? But in the last, 30 years, I've really have seen a resurgence of, our traditional crafts and our traditional ceremonies, and bringing back the things that really made us a community. And so now, if that's the life, and you're forced to raise your children in organized religion, which is not our way, but can make it very difficult, right? If you want to practice your traditional ways and your abusive partner does not allow you to do that, and in fact forces you to attend ceremonies from a different religion, that can be very difficult. And then using our beliefs to justify their abuse, right? And one of the ones that I've heard quoted often is, oh, well, you know what? Women were always told to walk behind their man, right? You know why that is? Because you're not equal to us. You're less than us. Well, if you're Native American, you know that that's not true. Women did walk behind men on the trails, but it was so that men could face any attacks that might be coming, and to protect the women. And so using those, women can't be on the drum, women can't sing, women can't be in a sweat with a man, women can't touch medicine. And yes, there are some truth to each of those depending upon the tribe that you're from, but there are reasons for that, and often it had more to do with whether or not a woman was on her moon time and was considered to be very powerful. And so, just really distorting traditional beliefs to support their own desire to control and maintain power over you, by saying that men were, at a higher level than you, that you weren't as important as men. So, it's this whole range of things that have been used to kind of, knock you down and keep you in your place, but really using the things that you hold the most dear to you against you. And so when we look at what the impact of this is, embarrassment, shame of who you are as a Native American, shame of, the traditions that we practice, being shamed for believing in our old ways. I think the isolation of that, not being able to reach out to somebody to go to ceremony with, to have ceremony with, it does isolate you from your community. When you can't reach out for that, it isolates you from your family and those closest to you. And really, it's a loss of safe space. When we look at the places that we're talking about and the ceremonies and traditions, those are considered safe places. And it's a loss of safe space so that you have no place to go for safety. And at the end of the day, it's a loss of healing. That is how we heal, through telling our stories, through sharing them, through being uplifted by the stories of others, by participating in gatherings where we come together, by participating in talking circles, by participating in sweat lodges, by participating in naming ceremonies, all of these things that really support our communities and make us whole, have been taken from us by one person, the person who's supposed to, love and protect you, right? So what can we do about that? How do we really overcome this? And really having an emotional safety plan is important. Finding ways to connect in spite of the restrictions that have been placed on you. If you are a friend or relative or of somebody who might be experiencing abuse, it's really important just to check in on them, to see how they're doing, to give them that connection. Even when they're not ready to make changes in their lives, just having connection. We're social beings, right, as humans. And we need that connection to feel complete. And so really connecting whenever and however you can is important. Participating in ways that you can, safe ways to participate in ceremonies or traditions. I think of, maybe not being able to go to sacred places, but yet we can still create a quiet area in our home, a quiet corner, where you can take 5 minutes to be with yourself and to pray. Creator will hear you no matter where you are. So making the time to do that is important. I think that, holding our medicines, just holding them, often, you think of smudging and how beneficial that is, how good it feels to smudge. And not being able to do that is difficult, but even holding your medicine in your hand, holding it in your hand for us, and I know it's different across, Indian country, different people have different ceremonies and traditions. For us, we hold that medicine in our left hand because that's the hand that's closest to our heart. And just holding that, praying with it in your hand, and then maybe placing it in a clean, quiet area, next to a tree in your yard, someplace, that's, not in a place of walking and, just someplace safe. You can put cedar in your shoes, put your medicine in your shoes, and kind of creates that barrier, making a tea. As they say, we use cedar for almost everything. you know, but making it cedar tea and drinking it, you know, so, you know, collecting the medicines and then using them in your everyday activities is important. And these are all really part of an emotional safety plan for yourself. And, you know, we think that there's this thought of, particularly I think among women, that, you know, we're so busy taking care of everybody else that we feel selfish and we feel guilty for taking time out for ourselves. But that's not the way it was ever intended to be, right? We need to take care of ourselves so that we can take care of others, you know, and I shouldn't even have to say it that way, you know, that we take care of ourselves in order to take care of somebody else. But sometimes that's the only way we hear it, right? We can hear it is in our relationship to the jobs and duties and responsibilities that we have as women. But just as human beings, we have a responsibility to ourselves to be the best that we can be. And these are all things that can help us get there. You know, just taking care of our spirit is important, you know. And when we think of self-care, we think of things like just doing something that you enjoy, that you might not have time to do every day, but making time to read if that's what you enjoy, garden if you enjoy having your hands in the dirt, feeling that connection to the earth, getting outside for a walk, just for the quiet and the being with nature. You know, all of those things that we can do, you know, getting lost in a movie, right? Sometimes the stress is so bad that you just want, you know, you've heard the old, well, maybe you haven't, but, you know, commercials in my day, you know, Calgon, take me away, right? It was a bubble bath kind of thing. But, you know, really immersing yourself in something to take your mind off the things that are, you know, are not doing you good, not doing your heart good. We need those breaks, and it's not selfish. It's not being self-absorbed. It's necessary. It's you know, we have to do that for ourselves. Nobody else is going to do it for us. And we have a responsibility to our bodies, really, and our heart and our spirit to do those things. And that's all part of, you know, that emotional safety planning that we can do for ourselves. And really, you know, you can help if you have friends or relatives who are experiencing violence. That's something that you can help them to do. Remind them of, you know, that they're worth it. They deserve it. Because quite often they don't think they are. They don't believe that they're worthy. So as friends and relatives, that's something that we can reinforce for them. I want to tell you a little bit about StrongHearts Native Helpline, of which I'm the director. We are a project of the National Domestic Violence Hotline and the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. We were formed in 2017, although the work on this project started probably back in 2012. And we have been long advocating for a helpline for Native Americans because we know that resources in our communities are very thin on the ground. And who do you call if you don't have a program in your community? And so this is you know, we kind of play the part of filling a gap in services for our relatives. We exist to restore power to Native Americans impacted by domestic violence, dating violence, and sexual violence by weaving together a braid of safety, sovereignty, and support. And our vision is a return to our traditional life ways where our relatives are safe, violence is eradicated, and sacredness is restored. So we're a helpline, as I said. and we can be reached. Our number is there. We also have chat advocacy. So, you can go to our website and there's a chat now icon. So you can get help without ever saying a word out loud. Right now, we are available every day from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. Central Standard Time. And for callers who reach out after hours, simply by pressing, a 1, you can be connected with the National Domestic Violence Hotline, who is one of our founding partners. And this was really important to us because we know that people do call us after hours, and we don't ever want to leave somebody without an option to speak with somebody. And so we do have that option just to press 1. And our advocates offer emotional support, peer support, and crisis intervention. They provide assistance with safety planning, how to stay safe, both when you're in a bad relationship, when you're leaving one, and even after you've left. Can all be, very different forms of safety planning, and it's important to do all of those. We provide a lot of education about domestic and sexual violence. So many people call us and they know something's wrong, but if they don't experience physical violence to the point of needing care, they don't term it domestic violence. They don't see themselves as victims of domestic violence. And one of the biggest things we do are referrals to tribal or Native-centered resources. So we know that people need more support than just one phone call can give. And so we always try to get them back to a resource in their community or as close as we can, so that they have somebody closer to them that they can establish an ongoing relationship with. And I'll give you just some of our recent statistics. This is for just the most recent month, so December of last year. You can see by looking at this, the color purple we had is the biggest percentage of those calling us were victims of intimate partner violence. We also get a lot of calls from people who are victims of other crimes or other situations that are looking for support, but it's not intimate partner violence. And, we always try to help whoever calls us, regardless of what their need is. We don't ever want, it's so hard to reach out, right? That we don't ever want to leave somebody just kind of hanging without any a referral someplace. So we always try to help find something. We get a lot of administrative calls, which is the kind of the light green. It's 25. We have a lot of people calling us just to say, hey, we heard about you. We want to understand what you're doing. How can we partner together? We also take calls from advocates who are looking for a resource for somebody that might not be in their area, or, trying to find additional resources for people. If you're working with somebody, you can always give us a call and we can try to help nail down additional resources. We get a lot of calls from helpers. So that kind of a dusty pink color is, helpers. So they're calling on behalf of either a friend or a relative who is experiencing violence, and they're looking for ways to help them. They want to make sure that when they talk to them, that they're saying and doing the right things, which can be so important. We do get a lot of calls about other issues. I think that this is the only national helpline for Native Americans. And again, people are looking for help and they don't know where to turn to. And so we do get a lot of calls about other issues that, you know, are not related to intimate partner violence. But again, we do our best to help everybody that calls us. In the month of December, you know, we took calls from across the age spectrum, with our youngest one being between the ages of 13 and 15, and our oldest one being between the ages of 73 and 75. And that's, you know, when you see it like this, it's disturbing to know that it impacts every age, right? Of course, the people that we speak to the most are you know, late 20s, 30s, and early 40s. That those seem to be the ages that are most comfortable reaching out for help. You know, we get less of the younger ones, and then again, less of our elders reaching out for help. We are one of the things that we are doing in the near future is we will be implementing text, so that you'll be able to just text our number. Again, that's just another way for people to reach out. I know that, especially among young people, they don't really use their phones so much for making phone calls, but they definitely are on there chatting and texting with their friends and relatives. And so we think it's really important for us to get that service up and running. And we hope to do that in the next month or so, actually. And so that's the age groups. And what are they experiencing? 76% of people who call us or who called us in the month of December were experiencing emotional abuse. And it's a tie with actually that physical abuse. They're usually fairly close. You know, as I said, that, you know, physical abuse is the one that we seem to know the most about, but emotional abuse is right up there with, you know, the tactics that are used to control a partner. Financial abuse, 25%. Many of our callers just don't have the funds needed to leave an abusive relationship. They don't have the funds needed to establish, you know, safe housing for themselves and their family members. 16% are experiencing sexual abuse, 14% that digital abuse, the electronic tracking and, you know, demanding to know your passwords and, you know, monitoring, you know, everything that you're doing online. And in December, 7% experience cultural abuse. So there's, you know, a wide spectrum of what is being experienced out there, and for people that are calling us. And when we look at what our contacts need, 64% needed peer support. And something that we have found, you know, in our collaboration with the National Domestic Violence Hotline, we do find that when our relatives call us, that they really need somebody to listen to them. They need somebody to hear them and to validate what they're experiencing. So we spend a lot of time providing that peer-to-peer support, and just letting people know that you don't know, you're not crazy. This is happening, and it is wrong, and there are some things that you can do, right? 34% of our callers have reported needing shelter. That's generally a high number for us. You know, people they don't have someplace else to go. And right now with the pandemic, it's really hard to find shelters. You know, as we know, some of the shelters have reduced their capacity in order to allow for social distancing. And people are not leaving shelter as easily as they did. It's a really difficult situation. 30% of people that contact us need legal advocacy. So that could be how to file for child support. It could be how to file for divorce or a separation, how to get a personal protection order. All of those types of things, and needing somebody to help them walk them through those processes or find supportive services around those. 19% really needed an ongoing support group for victims of domestic and sexual violence. Understanding that they knew it was going to be a long haul. It's not just a flip a switch and walk out of a relationship and it's over. And you really do need that ongoing support of people who understand what you're going through and who have been there and who can, sometimes just hearing somebody else's story lets you know that you're not alone and that, you can get through this, right? And so that support group is I think, a critical piece that people often don't think about. 16% reported needed transportation. Transportation is a big one as well. Many of our relatives live in geographically remote areas that don't have public transportation. I live in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. We don't have bus services. We don't have, I think actually now we have one Uber driver in our community, and so that transportation is huge if you don't have a vehicle of your own, or if you don't have one that's reliable. And many of our people don't have access to the public transportation that you might find in more urban areas. I wanted to talk a little bit about resilience. So many times we do presentations and our focus really is on all of the bad things that happen in our communities. We focus on the need for resources. We focus on the lack of money. We focus on the poverty, on the violence, on the substance abuse, the need for mental health care. I've not done this before, but I listened to a presentation a couple of months ago, and they actually ended on a high note. And I felt so much better leaving that presentation because it can be depressing talking about all of our unmet needs and all of our, just kind of the bad things that happen in our communities. But at the end of the day, in spite of everything that our ancestors went through, we're still here. In spite of all the attempts to assimilate us, to, lose everything native about us, we're still here. We're still drumming. We are still participating in powwows. We're still dancing, and we're still making our traditional crafts. And that's huge. We are resilient, and we can rise from all of the things that have been done to us to eliminate us, basically. And we can make sure that our children learn these things. The baskets that you see on the screen actually are black ash baskets, a traditional craft here that is, part of our traditions, my tribe's tradition. And they're made by friends of mine, and they call their company From Log to Basket. And they physically chop down trees. They pound the ash tree until it strips, and I tried it. It's incredibly hard. But they're teaching this skill to other people because they want this to survive, right? And so these are all, our participation in these are all forms of resilience. And, I think it's just really important to remember that. And if you look at this screen, you see us, we have representatives at some of the most important tables in the country, right? A couple of years ago, we saw Sharice Davis and Deb Holland elected. And they're, two of the most powerful women in our country now are Native American, right? And you see in the lower right-hand corner, it was the signing of the Violence Against Women Act in 2013. And those are Native women up there with the president, Native women who told their stories and who convinced Congress that we needed improvements to protect Native women and children, and they were invited to go back for the signing of that. And then in the lower left-hand corner is a tribal consultation. And in it, you see the 6 chairs draped with shawls. And that's the shawl ceremony that representing people that can't be there, that are no longer with us, that have lost their lives due to violence. And to see that at a consultation with the federal government, our ceremonies opening up these very important conversations, it's just a reminder of, that we are surviving, we are resilient. And I just think it's, it left me with such a good feeling to, when I left the presentation that I was at before, that I wanted to include that. Presentations moving, remind everybody, remind myself that in spite of it all, we are still here. And so that is my presentation. If there are questions or comments, I'm happy. Sorry, my mouse is very responsive. I'm happy to take any questions. I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen share.
Lori, we do have a few questions from the attendees. So
Okay.
one of them is about your organization.
Okay.
Asking, do you know the percentages of your calls that are by the victims only, or do you get people calling in for information to help someone else? So I know you did mention that, but is that allotted in the breakdown of 76% is about emotional or physical? Do you account for that as it's mentioned by the helpers that you described?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can get back to that slide. Let me try this. So if I go back to the slide where we were talking about, so, sorry. So 89%, in the month of December, 89 out of 181 were actual victims of domestic violence. And so, that was about almost right about 50% in that month. And so then, 25 out of that, 181. So about 15% were administrative calls, trying to find out, what exactly we do, how we can partner with other people. Let me see, what was our helpers? Those were 8, so a very small number. 4% were people who were calling on behalf of another person. And then again, these change over the months. And I think, looking at this number, this 181 calls that we answered during the month of December, we do know that December is often a slow month for domestic violence programs. With the holidays, I think people try to keep their families together during the holidays, and we see that our call numbers do go down during those times. So that, that kind of plays into this a little bit as well. But yeah, so that's, that was for the month of December.
Great, thanks, Lori. I typed that response in the Q&A as well, just in case people didn't hear that. So we have quite a few other questions. One that stood out was to explain what smudging is for people who don't know.
Yeah, so for smudging, it's using a combination of our medicines for us here in the Woodlands area. So the Michigan and Anishinaabe communities, we use cedar, sweetgrass, sage, tobacco sometimes, but it really is, placing that into an object and lighting it on fire, and then using a feather generally, or your hands, to bring that up and over you. And it really is a form of gosh, the only word that's coming to me is disinfect, and that's not correct, but I'm thinking in terms of COVID. But really, it's a form of cleansing, right? Cleansing your spirit. You can also smudge areas so that if an area of your home, you can smudge your home to rid it of just that bad energy, right? It's medicine being used to cleanse and remove the bad energy, the bad spirit that might be there.
Great, thank you. I just sent that response as well. Someone also asked, do you find that these experiences of historical trauma creates a sense of solidarity amongst most natives? I'm thinking about resilience.
I think it does, right? I think that, in some ways we've seen more unity, especially I think in more recent years, while everything's improved, right? With the internet and the ability to connect with other people is so much easier today than it was, when I was younger. But I think it does create, a shared experience does bind. It can bind people. And I do think that it binds us as Native Americans. I do think that we have a special relationship with each other, and sometimes, we definitely have been at odds, our tribes versus another tribe in different, for different reasons. But for the most part, we do support and recognize each other as relatives. And I think that very much, that shared experience of trauma definitely does provide that bonding for us.
Thank you, Lori.
Mm-hmm.
So we have another question about, since many survivors don't have funds to leave their relationship, is anything being done to open a shelter, for instance?
Yeah, shelters are a critical piece of the response to intimate partner violence. And when I talked a little bit about resource disparity, across the country, there are probably close to 1,600 shelters. But for Indian country, for those of us that reside either, in or on reservations, or like in the state of Alaska, there are only 60 shelters that are Native centered, operated by tribes, or tribal organizations. And so there's a great need for more shelters. Funding is not what we would like it to be. It has been better in recent years. And I do think that with the new administration coming in, I think that we can look forward to additional funding for these critical services. But I would highly recommend to people that are working within tribal organizations to look for those opportunities from the Office on Violence Against Women. You can look them up on the internet. They're part of the Department of Justice, and that's where the largest percentage of money dedicated to domestic violence in Indian country is through the Office on Violence Against Women.
Thank you. There is another question about, do you have recommendations on how to provide more outreach from advocacy programs to Native American communities who may need support that may not know how to get a hold of us?
Yeah, I worked in my tribal community for 30 years before, moving out to different organizations. And it seemed like no matter what we did, there were still people that didn't know that we existed and didn't know about the services that we offered. And so, social media is huge these days. When we do collect demographics, our hotline is completely anonymous and confidential, but we do collect non-identifying information. And, a large percentage of our callers find us on the internet. Right. And so we do have social media accounts. We're active on, Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. We're looking at implementing a couple of other things, but being active, on social media, I think is really important for reaching people today. Certainly participating or sponsoring health fairs in your community. If you have a tribal newspaper, make sure you're submitting articles for every paper that if it's a monthly paper or however that is, however often that gets out there, that's an important way to do it. But yeah, it's hard. Even today, it's hard for us to connect with the people that need us. So I guess that's where I would start.
Thanks, Lori. There is another question about, do you think Native American women would feel more comfortable working with another advocate of color, even if they are not Native American as well?
That's an interesting question. As I said, we are a helpline that's devoted to Native Americans and Alaska Natives. But we do get a large percentage of our calls. Obviously, we're going to help whoever calls us, right? Even though that's kind of our target population, why we were formed. We help whoever calls us. And we do get a high percentage of people calling us from other, cultures, if you will. So, members of the Black community, members of the, other people of color do contact us. And I think that there is a comfort there and again, we're talking about that kind of shared experience. And so other communities who have experienced oppression, I think connect better And that seems to be the case for us in that they are calling us as well. And so, you know, I think that shared experience is important, and I think that there is more understanding there potentially.
Thank you. I think in that question, and I think you did a great job answering it, but there was a little thing of, do Native American women feel more comfortable working with another advocate of color? So an advocate who is Native American versus an advocate who is a person of color for a victim who is Native American. Does that, what you just said, does that still apply in that sense?
Okay, I misunderstood. I was thinking in terms of if they couldn't have a Native advocate, would they prefer a person of color over a person of, you know, mainstream society? Is the way I was answering the question. I think something that sometimes can be difficult is I did talk about, you know, just that closeness that we have in our communities can make it difficult to reach out in our own communities. And so sometimes, you know, there may be a discomfort in speaking with a Native advocate from your community. I haven't really found that to be true, but it may be for some.
Thank you, Lori.
Sure.
Let's see, there's a lot of questions I'm trying to look through.
Sure.
There's a question about the large amounts of Native American women who also go missing. How does that fit in the context of intimate partner violence and domestic violence within the Native community?
Yeah, you know, I think that there is definitely a connection, right? When you look at the missing and murdered movement, murder is kind of at the far end of the continuum, right? And of violence. And so I do think that there very much is a connection. And you know, um, it's but it is something that, you know, I think it's important to understand that, and I think it's important to acknowledge that connection, and really understand that, you know, as I said, in some states the rates of murder of women, you know, is 10 times the state average, and 75% of those women murdered were murdered at the hands of an intimate partner. um, you know, so there definitely is a connection, and it's something that, you know, it's why the services that we offer are so important, right? To help, you know, these women find safety is so critical. And so um, yeah, definitely connected.
There's a question about the helpline. You may have explained, but can you confirm if your organization works with local Native American communities because you are based in Michigan, correct?
Okay. Our helpline is actually based in Minnesota. It's in Eagan, Minnesota. But with the pandemic, we are all working from home. You know, I give kudos to our advocates who have really taken on this challenge of working from home. You know, we rolled out in March to working from home. And we do work with programs across the country. I didn't really talk about our database. And one of the first things we did when we first formed was we actually contacted all of the tribes in the country, all of them, to ask them how they were responding to domestic violence in their communities, and whether or not they had a program, and, you know, what kind of services they offered. And we put all of that information into our database so that when somebody calls, say somebody calls from Kansas, we can look in Kansas and see what tribes are there and what programs are there that are available to, tribal members. And so, yeah, we work closely with them in terms of making sure that, the information that we have is up to date. And then when we're talking with somebody, we'll actually make a warm handoff to them. So that means that we will, physically call that program and explain the situation that our caller is experiencing, and then connect them so that the person who calls us doesn't have to make that kind of a cold call, right? So we can hand them off in a way that is, I think, more comfortable for them, and not having to, again, start from zero, right? We can kind of get them past that hump and actually speaking to another person.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So there's a question: on a collective level, do you feel as though cultural appropriation of Native culture contributes to cultural and spiritual harm and abuse experienced by Natives? If so, can you share responses to cultural appropriation by the Native communities?
Well, we see it, we see it all over the place, right? We see, we've seen various magazines, models wearing, Native inspired headdresses, clothing, and I think that oftentimes they're sexualized. And you hear the Pocahontas, right, instead of kind of a Pocahontas and haughty combination word. And so I do think cultural appropriation does impact how people view us. They have this image of Native Americans that's so far out of context and so far from reality. And I do think that, it's perpetuated in our media, and even, our Disney movies, right? Pocahontas was, she was even sexualized in a Disney movie, and, with the tiny little waist and, the big breasts and, just, I think the way that we're portrayed in media in general needs a lot of work, and it needs a lot of people standing up to blast the media when they get it wrong, or when when products are released that disparage Native Americans. I think it's important for us to stand up, because it does perpetuate stereotypes, and that's harmful to us on many levels. But I do think it can lead into this, this kind of this cultural abuse piece as well. And we've been successful in recent years, right, in getting people to drop products. And look at the Washington football team. After years and years of asking them to stop using their name, they've finally done it. So I think that we can come together collectively to challenge those when they happen.
I'm trying to keep up with all of the incredible things that you're saying. Maybe we'll take maybe a few more questions if you're okay with that, Lori.
Yeah, I'm good with that. Sure.
Okay. So there's a question of, can you speak more of peer support and how your agency works and trains your peer partners?
Yeah, our advocates start out with about 80 hours of training to start, and it is a comprehensive training that really, you know, gives them a good foundation on, you know, domestic violence, what it is, sexual violence, what they are, what they look like, what the tactics that are used. That's really important. But we also feel that it's so important for people to understand the cultural piece and our history, you know, our historical trauma, um, how important culture and traditions are to Native Americans, and have a really good understanding of that. You know, obviously, as I said, there's, you know, 574 tribal nations right now that are federally recognized. So we can't know all of the, you know, traditions of each tribal nation, but we know that there are a lot of commonalities, right? We know that, you know, tribes have the respect for all living things, and you know, and so there are things that we can build off of. But really, when they're talking with somebody that calls in, we explore what the cultures and traditions of the caller are with them. And so, you know, we can't possibly know it all, but we can be respectful of, and you know, finding out and directing somebody back to their own community, right? But it is a very intense training. It's, you know, we do a lot of training about how to talk with somebody about difficult subjects, how to kind of demystify things, how to provide that education. And so it's a pretty intense initial training period. And then our advocates will monitor other advocates for a period to, you know, gain tips on how to respond. You know, there's a lot of technology that they have to learn, you know, just in terms of, well, it's not a lot of technology. I'm not a very techie person, so it seems like a lot to me. But you know, just everything we do is on the computer. Our phones are computer based. Our system is all in the cloud, so to speak. But so there, you know, it's a lot of training, and then a lot of monitoring other advocates. And then once they start to take calls, we monitor them very closely so that we can help them through any rough spots as they kind of, you know, put their new skills to use.
Great, thank you. I think that is all the time that we have. If it's okay with you for me to share your contact information in the follow-up email, I can do that as well. If not, you can always reach out to the hotline, in the helpline, sorry. If you have any questions, I'm sure the advocates would be happy to direct you to the person who can answer your question. But I just want to say a huge thank you again to Lori Jump for this incredible presentation and providing your perspective and insight on this very, very important topic and population that is often underrepresented in our conversations about domestic violence. So I appreciate you taking the time to be here. And you can feel free to say any closing remarks, but for the attendees, I just sent the information on how to request a certificate of attendance for today's webinar. We also will have the recording and the PowerPoint slides emailed to you to the email that you used to register for the event. Laura, you can have any final remarks, you're welcome to do so.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it so much. And, you know, anything that we can do at StrongHearts to support, you know, people that might be on the webinar, or tribal programs, you know, non-tribal programs that are looking for ways, you know, to work with tribal people, please reach out. We're so happy to help any way that we can. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll go ahead and close out the webinar. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thank you.